Portrait, Chapter 5. From the scroll. And just a bit more on that first backpacking trip. That unfamiliar certainty of my arrival. That quietness. It really carries no fear with it. I had brought with me a library copy of the Dharma Bums. It was such a joy not only to have it and read it under those stars, but also to lend it to my instructor one night just to dig on, even though he had read it years ago and knew all about it. He was so happy that I had it. Of course, it was perfect in those woods. There were maybe 6 of us plus 2 leaders with real outdoor experience. My tent partner was Dibble, who I actually knew from high school, but not like I was getting to by then. He was tangibly my polar opposite. The surface, but so goes for Madness, my hero. Another figure in our party was Nick Grip, who I met on the first day of class and was in the same first year interest group, which meant there were already significant similarities to dig on. He was a couple of years older than me, which felt like eons to both of us, because at that point it really was. He had all sorts of wilderness experience already, mainly from being sent to the wilderness against his will for a 3-month exile that was really designed to condition behavior and keep him out of trouble. But it seemed like a sliver of him was made right, but mainly he was still a fireball. I played listener because he always had so many stories to share and felt free to still instigate in my own way with a heart and lots of sentimentality. And this dynamic was a rag ball. All of it. We knew it. All because we really only wanted to dig and enjoy. Ignore the pitfalls of what Nick called the psychobabble bullshit. Wait a minute. You're gonna have to back up or at least slow down and explain that term. You think we knew how to define that one? Really, though, it was what it was and still is. Everything else in the world either changes or deceives us, staying the same. Maybe other people called it pretense, worse than small talk, worse than a waste of time. It's at least partially a contributor to why it took less than 1 semester for Dibble to be expelled and sent packing. And he was always best at sniffing it out, barking back at it. There's barely anything to do with the duality of compliance versus rebellion. Probably more to do with sentimentality versus autopilot. Putting it in words makes for elusive posturing, but Nick calling it psychobabble bullshit worked for me and even made it easier to live in opposition to it at all costs. Rebellion for the sake of it was perhaps a form of psychobabble itself, but too often we encapsulated our behaviors we were written off and laughed at for taking it to the extremes, such as hitchhiking across the country later on that summer. Excuse me. That is definitely a different story. Yeah, we left New York, the open road, like everybody else fed up with society 50 years ago too, but the last thing we were really up to was escaping our selfish suburban blues. Even now it feels easy to say that we knew why we were hitchhiking without a real destination, but really, it took dropping my smartphone in the gutter on accident around 35 days into the trip to finally confirm that all that was psychobabble and that we could not only have more fun without smartphones, but actually also make time a lot better. Eliminate such a distraction. We were making great time out there. Why back up? Chapter 6. It all moves so fast anyway, so why back up? I sometimes feel not because it seems like I'm at the end of it, or that it may run dry, but that a shift in medium is required sometimes, and sometimes very abruptly, as fast as possible, required. When I shift, I don't really change what I'm thinking about in the moment. There's an element of getting out of my own way that I maintain. Sometimes it comes to create. That sort of thing is really all it takes for me to keep things fresh, ever-changing. I never really intend for the things I say in average conversation to ultimately be picked up, but according to the Jaguar, some component of what I said was working. When I was painting in the studio one night, it was enough to clear any semblance of his creative inhibition. I didn't even realize it. It struck him at the right moment under the right circumstances and made him completely an artist and fruitful, productive one, even though any interest in reading about art or studying technique was left out. Definitely seemed to help him, even if it did sometimes confuse him or leave him unsure of solutions to certain components. I tried so many times to rant with what I'm sure the wild stories and general enthusiasms that did sometimes enthuse him too. Never quite make him ask to borrow a book from my shelf or obsess over Picasso. One book he did borrow from me, and he actually made his own study of it, was Picasso, but miraculously and in legendary fashion, he interpreted the reproduction with full certainty completely sideways. He saw a portrait in a still life, he said, and with such conviction never even realized that the book was sideways, even after completing the study. Meanwhile, the first sketchbook I gave him, a sturdy one with paper heavy enough and designed to be able to manage significant washes, it's just about full, not quite of just his work, but so many others, many of which he convinced were artists after they told him the contrary. Back and forth a few times through, now he has passed the pages, filling in new spots in the book that were mostly sparsely filled before. Who am I to even get close to doing anything or saying anything that would jeopardize that? But ultimately, I never want to do something as ridiculous as indoctrinate anyone. That would be the opposite of what I even try to say with my art rants. But instead, keep the floodgates open, demonstrate that the hurdles along the way are wonderful to figure out independently. But that really the early moderns teach us about independence too. Not fill us with a million different ways to hold a brush, but instead a million little jolts of madness and enchantment and experience that keeps the floodgates open. He's tried pretty much every medium I've tried. Sometimes comes over with a specific mood, needing a specific medium, but very quickly he has taken a specific lean towards metallic markers, almost brush pens. I wonder as I sit at the typewriter and let a big watercolor wash dry, about different elements of the physicality of painting and technique, and the peculiar experience, not exactly just throwing paint without a concept, but instead letting that physicality and discovery component of not quite knowing, but kind of almost subconsciously letting it take weight over the conceptual element without sacrificing honesty. That fleeting, arguably important responsibility we have as artists to be trustworthy of the spiritual nuance that the observer will either feel or reject. The Jaguar, Dibble, Kerouac, sentimentality.